Hello and welcome to PsychBoost. In this video we'll be looking at Romanian orphan studies, in particular one by a researcher called Rutter. Our key terms will be deprivation, privation and institutionalisation. We'll have some extra evaluative research and I'll give you ways you can extend your evaluations in an exam. So let's begin Romanian orphan studies. So first of all, when we use the term institutionalisation, what we mean is living away from the family. Now there are effects of living in institutions. This happens with adults when living in prisons. But when talking about children, of course, we'll be talking about orphanages and hospitals. Now extended stays in these institutions can change the way that you act. You may start to act permanently in ways which follow the rules of that institution. What it's going to do to you is going to remove your sense of personal identity, meaning that it leads to a process called Deindividuation, and factors mentioned in the previous video, affectionless psychopathy, delinquency, and low IQ, all of which identified by Bowlby in his theory of maternal deprivation. Now, there's a very sad case study, and it's to do with a group of children called the Romanian Orphans. In 1989, the Romanian communist government fell. The Romanian government up to this point had been requesting all women to have 5 children. Now clearly not all these women could afford to keep these 5 children. So many of them were placed into institutions, into orphanages. When the government fell, the rest of the world did find out about these orphans, and there were up to 300,000 of them. They were kept in very, very bad conditions. These children didn't have many forms of physical and emotional care from the staff. The staff were far too overwhelmed by the sheer number of children, and many of the children were very malnourished. Very little care was given to feeding them, and some children were abused as well. So previously we talked about deprivation, and deprivation is when you don't get the right amount of emotional care from your primary caregivers, and that might be because the person you've attached to is frequently absent or away for a long time. Privation is a little different. Privation is the lack of any ability to form an attachment bond because no one is there to allow you to attach to them, and this is what happened to the Romanian orphans. They had no adult to attach to, no adult that would provide them any form of love and care. Now this situation allowed researchers to investigate what would happen to children who didn't gain any care in early childhood in a way that wouldn't violate ethical rules. The most famous is by a researcher called Rutter, and Rutter looked at the effect of institutionalisation. Rutter carried out a longitudinal study, so a research that's carried out over many years. This included 165 Romanian orphans. All of these orphans were adopted into British families, but they were in very different age categories. There were 58 under the age of 6 months, there were 59 between 6 and 24 months, and then there were 48 who were over 2 years, they were over 24 months of age. Rutter also had a control group of 52 British adoptees, who we can assume did have a good level of care before being adopted. Now when they first came into the study, about half of these Romanian children were very malnourished, and they were also observed to have very low IQ compared to what would be expected at their age. As this was longitudinal research, Rutter followed up at 4, at 6, at 11 and at 15. The results were, at age 6, those children who had been adopted after 6 months, there was a high number of children that showed a feature called Disinhibited Attachment. Now children should be wary of strangers, but these children would run up to strangers and hug them and sit on their lap and just be far too friendly with them. When these absolute strangers would leave the room, children would cry, as though they'd just been abandoned by someone they really cared about. When followed up at age 11, still about half these children who had disinhibited attachment still showed disinhibited attachment at 11. When assessed at this age, children also showed significant delayed intellectual development if they were in the categories that were adopted after 6 months of age, with those adopted after 24 months showing an average IQ as low as 77, significantly below the average of 100. Also in a small number of cases of the Romanian orphans, but in none of the cases of the British control group, there was seen quasi-autism tendencies. Some children really had a problem understanding the meaning of social context. Also intellectual problems were still seen at the 15-year follow-up. So there's quite a selection of results here. What do they actually suggest? Well, they certainly suggest that adoption within the first few months of life is really important. Deprivation and privation institutions can really lead to long-running effects. But we did see about half of the children aged 6 with disinhibited attachment getting past this problem. This maybe suggests that the effects aren't permanent, and that maybe the critical period argued by Bowlby is actually more of a sensitive period. Important, but maybe children can get over the problems with suitable care. Let's look at some other evaluations. Research by Rutter and others certainly led to a complete change in the way that adoption worked and care in orphanages worked. There was certainly an establishment of key workers in institutions to make sure that children had a very high level of care while they're in orphanages, and there's an absolute priority in trying to adopt children at the earliest point. Also, once children are adopted, there's significant follow-up to make sure that the new family are providing the right amount of care to that baby. A supportive study that shows a similar result to Rutter is Goldfarb. Goldfarb compared 15 children who'd been brought up in children's home until about 3, and another group that had been brought up in a children's home, but they'd been fostered at around 6 months. Now Goldfarb followed these children up when they were 12 years old, and he also found that very early fostering had resulted in a higher level of social skills, such as lower aggression levels, and also a higher level of IQ. A research study that seems to indicate that the effects of institutionalisation might not be permanent is Hodges and Tizard. These researchers found if children were adopted by effective families who were able to look after their needs, they actually scored better on measures of behavioural and peer relationships than they did compared to children who had returned back to their original families, showing that the care after the institution is important in later development. We could criticise Rutter's study directly by pointing out that the children weren't randomly assigned as to when they were adopted. Prospective parents went to the orphanages and chose the children themselves. It could have been that those children who were more sociable were adopted earlier on, leading to children with cognitive difficulties maybe being left aside until a later age. And another point is this research is longitudinal, which means it's still continuing. We're not 100% sure if these long-term effects are going to continue into early adulthood. It may be with a significant amount of time and care these children are able to develop into healthy adults. I really hope you found this video useful in studying psychology. 3 things help this channel grow along: likes, comments and subscriptions. Thank you so much if you've done any of those things for this video.